Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul podcast. Robert, I know we have been getting some great comments on iTunes, on Apple Podcast, and we really appreciate that. Podcast is doing very, very well, my friend.
I am so gratified, Thomas. It's just wonderful to see all of the listeners and their comments. It's just terrific.
Well, and we're also getting listener questions like this.
Hi, Thomas and Robert. It's Tiffany. I'm really enjoying the new podcast. Robert, you had mentioned in one of the episodes where you were talking about the nodal axes of the moons that you were in a few karmic relationships. How do you know if you are in one of those currently or have been in the past? Is that more of an intuitive thing, or is that something that actually shows up in the chart? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's such a great question. No, it is not intuition. Yes, it absolutely shows in the chart. First of all, I have to say I periodically teach a 3-hour webinar on relationships for Kepler College. So you can imagine the wealth of considerations that are involved in studying relationships in the horoscope. But first of all, wherever you have the major planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and the nodes, you will have karmic ties associated with the houses where those appear in your natal horoscope. And those relationships will be of the nature of that planet. And let me give you a tip for everybody. Well, first of all, you have karmic relationships in areas other than love and marriage. You have them in friendships. You have them in work relationships among coworkers or with bosses. You can have them with siblings or other relatives, parents. You can have them with teachers and mentors and so on. Here's the tip. People whose suns are within 3 degrees of your natal planets will be karmic relationships as well. For example, I have to use my own chart because it's off the top of my head and it's very easy. My moon is at 3 degrees Aries at birth, and my natal Venus is at 4 degrees Scorpio. And Aries and Scorpio women, get it? The moon and Venus? Aries and Scorpio women have always played an important role in my life, starting with Aries Linda Goodman, whose friendship kickstarted my career, actually. She was working on her second book, staying at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. She wasn't seeing clients when I met her because she was working on the book. And we went and had coffee for, no kidding, 4 hours. And at the end of that, she asked if she could refer clients to me. And I was very flattered and said, yes, of course. And as it turns out, the first and only client that she sent me was a Scorpio, a woman, a UCLA neurosurgeon's wife. And she began sending her friends to me. A lot of them were doctors' wives. The next thing I knew, their husbands, the doctors, were interested in readings. So Aries and Scorpio women have always been positive and beneficial for me in my life. Though not all of them were necessarily karmic, but I think that to any degree, if someone's birth sun is within 3 degrees of one of your natal planets, then there is a strong indication of a karmic tie between you. And that tie will be of the nature of the planet and the house and its aspects in your chart. Now, I happen to have, Thomas also, I have Saturn in my 7th house, which is one of the classic indications of marrying your karma, marrying a karmic mate, Saturn in the 7th. My Saturn is at 10 degrees Cancer, 21, exactly on my 7th cusp, on the descendant in Cancer. And lo and behold, my first adult live-in relationship, even though we didn't marry, was when I turned 21, which is 10 degrees Cancer, 21 minutes multiplied by 2. So again, using these degrees as clues for the ages at which these archetypes in your natal chart will be prominent or initiate. This was back in the mid-'60s in Los Angeles at the dawn of the free love generation. So marriage was optional in those days. And this was a Cancerian teacher who was 7 years older than I was. And we were together for a bit over 4 years. And my second relationship, also karmic, was at age 31, right on the cusp of my 31st birthday. That's my Saturn degree multiplied by 3. And again, older. But I liked older in those days, older by 7 years. And in this one, I got the wonderful experience of living with another man's children for that time, because I really always wanted children. I thought I did, and I did, but I hadn't had them because of the unsteady nature of my career, which by then was no longer as an actor in show business, but as an astrologer. Anyway, after we broke up, I never regretted not having children again, because I had been a good stepfather figure to her children, but I would not have been a good father over time. I had to ultimately, that was something that relationship taught me, because for me, children and their welfare take precedence over everything else. And I was simply too involved full time in my astrology career, and then a bit later in my television writing career. Plus, I did not have a good role model for fathering. I had a loving father. He was a good provider. But my own father had lost his father when he was 10 years old. So he never had a model for what a father was. And interestingly enough, in my horoscope, my Saturn in my 7th house, that is the 4th house from the father. The father is shown at the 4th in the natal chart. So the end of the matter. So at his age 10, even though this is my horoscope, if I'm reading it from the standpoint of my father, then I'm mentally looking at the 4th house in my chart as the 1st house of my father. And lo and behold, in his 4th house, showing in my natal chart, there is Saturn, death, in the 4th house of his father at age 10 by degrees. So that is how uncannily accurate these degrees can be. And it turned out my father and I indeed had a karmic relationship, which I didn't know, of course, at the time, but the very first experience that I had, Tiffany, of reincarnation or karma, it was very simple. I just, in meditating one night, asked myself, I'd never done any reincarnational exercises before. I just said to myself, is there some past life that I should know about that has meaning in this life? And suddenly, and for about maybe 20 or 30 seconds, I was in the middle of a scene that was pretty horrific. Again, it didn't last long, but the second that I came out of it, I was kind of jolted, really. I said, how does that have meaning in my life? And I heard the husband, because I was a woman in that life, the husband in that life is your father in this life. And the black slave in that life, this was on a plantation back in the early 1800s in Kentucky. Apparently, I had been imported from Spain as a kind of mail order bride, so to speak, for a much older plantation owner. The black slave in that life is your sister in this life. And the minute I heard that, I thought, oh my God, I was 2.5 when my sister was born. And she was so dark as a baby that my dad had them double check to make sure they had brought the right baby to her. So you can have karmic relationships really anywhere in your life. And as I say, it's the key to them, I think, is to look to see where you have the major planets, and especially if they are configured with either your 5th house of love affairs, or your seventh house of committed relationships like marriage or even business relationships. So I hope that helps steer you in the right direction.
I'd like to hone in on the 3 degrees sun from natal, because I think maybe let's create a little bit more expanded visual on that. So explain it again, and then let me ask a couple of questions around it.
Anybody that you meet whose sun is within 3 degrees of one of your natal planets will affect your life in ways that are consistent with that planet's archetype, its house position, its sign, and its aspect.
Any of your natal planets, or just the outer?
Any of them. Any of them.
Okay, all right.
Any of them.
So if the person you meet, and we're talking relationship, romantic relationship or not, but if you're able to discern somebody else's sun and you're in some kind of relationship with them, look to see where that sun is if it was within 3 degrees of
either
side of one of your planets.
Yes.
Including the nodes?
Yes, including the nodes. Especially including the nodes, because they're very much associated with karma, but yeah, absolutely.
Including part of fortune?
Yes.
Okay. Midheaven and ascendant? Are we talking all the points?
Yeah, yes, you can use the midheaven and ascendant. With the part of fortune, my only caution always is to make sure that the chart is rectified to your satisfaction, because the part of fortune synthesizes the sun, the moon, and the ascendant. And if the time of birth is off by 4 minutes, the ascendant will be off by 1 degree. And therefore, it will affect the part of fortune as well. So unless you plan to rectify a horoscope, I always do if I'm going to use the part of fortune. You just have to. But for example, I have my moon at 3 degrees Aries at birth. So anybody born within 3 days of March 24th of any year will have their sun conjunct my moon.
Right. Exactly.
And then conversely, you get into Cancer, and anybody born basically around the 2nd of July will have their sun conjunct my Saturn in Cancer in my 7th house. And indeed, my first real adult love was Cancerian.
Would this go as far as even house cusps, or is that going too far?
I don't know. I don't do that. I'm not saying you can't. I don't do that. Mainly, I use equal houses, which some people do and some people don't. And I have good reasons to use it. But but the truth is, I have found, Thomas, for example, with my moon in Aries and my Venus in Scorpio, just Aries and Scorpio women particularly, but that can also be men in my life, especially in a business context, because I have Venus in my 10th house. Even if their suns don't conjunct my moon or my Venus, if they're a Scorpio or an Aries, I have learned over the years now, I kind of automatically like them. And not that both signs aren't just as complex and problematic as any other sign, but I respond to them very well.
Yeah.
And they have turned out to be really important. A woman who got me into screenwriting actually was an astrology client of mine, an Aries woman named Joan Tewksbury, who wrote the movie Nashville that Robert Altman did back in those days. And she was instrumental. She was an astrology client, but she turned out to be absolutely instrumental in giving me basically a one-woman seminar on screenwriting. I'd written a spec script, and I asked her if she'd mind reading it. And she invited me out to her house for 4 hours and went through that. So it was like a private seminar. And she actually did teach writing at UCLA. So there's another Aries woman. So the minute I meet an Aries woman, I'm there for whatever. They're always bright and stimulating and fascinating, just like Linda Goodman was.
So maybe there is something to bringing it down to the sign level as well.
I think so. I really do. Now, if it's within 3 degrees on either side of a natal planet, that's a really strong contact and very likely to be karmic.
Do you combine intuition with it?
Oh, I don't think you can ever avoid intuition.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
You're reminding me of a great book called The Gift of Fear by, oh gosh, what's his name? Gavin, can't think of his name offhand. Gift of Fear is a wonderful book. He's worked with the police for a number of years, and it's all about intuition and listening to it. So I think anybody in these fields, of course, you have intuitions and feelings about people and so on. You can't ignore them and shouldn't. But astrology gives you something specific. It's a snapshot of space-time from an astronomical point of view out of the ephemera. So these are physical archetypes that we have in specific positions, and no. In fact, people sometimes across the years, I'll say something from a horoscope. They'll say, "Oh, you're psychic," and I'll say, "No, I'm not. Let me show you where it shows up," and I show them. So that's the difference, I think, I think if anything, astrology helps you hone your intuitions. But of course, you get to the point really where you go through life. You don't need to look at a horoscope when you meet somebody. You know how you feel about them. But when you're reading for people, there, I think you have to try and stay objective, which sometimes can mean maybe conflicting with your intuitive feelings. There are, some clients who are very difficult to deal with, but you have to deal with them if you've agreed to do a reading, and you need to know how to deal with them, I think, constructively. So that's one of the great things I learned from the year and a half in that men's psychology group I went to, was how to do exactly that.
Well, and this almost parlays right into one of the other listener questions that we have coming up, is that not necessarily all karmic relationships, quote unquote, are benefic, if you will.
Well, look at me. I have Saturn on my seventh cusp, and it's in a grand cross with it's opposite my ascendant, and it squares both my sun-moon opposition. And all you can say is that that's a karmic relationship, and that I am drawn to Saturnian people, men or women, in business ties, love ties, anywhere. I like Saturn. I like people who have some depth to them, who are serious about their lives, and who know what they're talking about. And in both those relationships, I learned a great deal. Obviously, my limit apparently is about 4 to 5 years. But so I can't say that Saturn is a malefic in that sense. Saturn is about the truth. It's about justice. It's about the truth. Well, if you don't like the truth, tough. And believe me, with that Grand Cross as a child, I tried to escape. I was a Libra with my sun conjunct Neptune. I lived in dreams and fantasies and all of that. So I've had to learn how to be responsible and to be honest with myself first. And that's Saturn. So it's a malefic. And in certain situations, for example, in orrery, it can be read that way partly, but Saturn is a marvelous planet. So it's nothing to be afraid of. But by the same token, I have Uranus and Gemini in my sixth house. So I have always had karmic relationships through my work of a Uranian nature, and so on.
I won't go in too deep into this story, but my first marriage was to somebody that we very synchronistically met. In other words, kind of purposed, right? And as I came to understand astrology, and especially the second and eighth house axis and things in my chart that were going on there, realized that this was a karmic relationship involving a past due debt of money. And boy, did she get it. That debt is cleared and paid. Stamped. Thank you very much. Move on.
That's funny.
So be careful with them. Be careful. You don't know which side of that karma you're dealing with. All right, Robert, this has been great. Thank you, as always, for these wonderful insights into our karmic relationships.
Thank you, Thomas.
Robert is booking readings. He's booking them out a couple of months now, but if you'd like to get on that list, check out the link in the show notes to our Glasscock, 4 site.com, and you can get in touch with him by email. Thank you so much for listening to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. We'll see you next time.